All you ladies are looking great. Welcome to tonight's radio broadcast. I hope you're all having a hoppin' night. Our verse for tonight comes from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 14. And it says, "And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" You know, there's a program on TV once in a while, and they go back in time. And they go back in time to a particular point in history. They explain how things were done during that time period. And sometimes they meet historical figures. That's what I'd like for us to do. Be time travelers. Go back in time. Meet some wonderful Christian women who all had an impact on history. First, we're going to go way back to biblical times to meet a few women from the Bible. And then we'll go on and meet some other Christian women at other points in history. But before we do that, we need to have a word from our sponsor.
Kool-Aid, a partisan treasure makes 2 quarts of Kool-Aid, 9 great flavors taste good. Kool-Aid,
For the very best drink you ever made.
Kool-Aid,
Be sure that the envelope says
Kool-Aid.
You can give your youngsters a lot of pleasure with Kool-Aid. You know it's pure and good. It has the Parents Magazine seal. And it's so thrifty. A 5-cent package makes 2 full quarts. Just add Kool-Aid to water with ice. Add some sugar and stir.
For the very best drink you ever made.
Be sure that the envelope says
Kool-Aid.
Welcome back. Our first stop on our journey through time, we end up in Persia and meet Queen Esther, who lived during the reign of King Xerxes, who reigned in Persia around 486 to 465 BC. The book of Esther is one of my favorites. There is so much going on in this story. It starts out in chapter 1, describing all the things in the court of the garden of the king's palace where they had a feast. It talks about the wall hangings, the marble pillars, the golden couches, and even the gold vessels. All of those details found throughout the book of Esther make the history come to light for me. Our main verse comes from Esther 4:14. "And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Esther 4:14. The words in that verse is something Esther's uncle Mordecai said to Esther. Because of Esther's courage and bravery, she was able to save the Jews from disaster. God had an important purpose for her life. Next on our travels, we meet Mary, the mother of Jesus. What an important part in history that Mary played. Mary gave birth to baby Jesus, who became the Savior of the world. In order for Mary to have been chosen for this great undertaking, she was living her life just as God had intended. A pure life can have such an impact on the world. Let's take another break and hear from our sponsors.
Billy Brown, the smoothest, coolest guy in town. The jigsaw seems to stick his jive. Hey, tell us, Bill, how can we arrive? It's easy, Jack. Any gal gets set when you flash a smile by Pepsodent. You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent.
Pepsodent's new improved formula cleans teeth whiter than ever. Tastes brighter, too. New formula Pepsodent contains IMP. There's nothing else as good at getting teeth white.
You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent.
There's just one spirit left.
You worked too hard, you ate too much, the cheesecake made you greedy, but you're aching in and stomach here. This message from old Speedy. Alka-Seltzer, block, block, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief plop, fizz, fizz. Oh, what a relief it is. Ah, those speedy Alka-Seltzer bubbles burst into action to relieve your upset stomach and aching head fast. As only as directed. Oh, what a relief it is. What a relief.
All right, welcome back, ladies. We are now going to skip ahead a couple of decades and hear about some more cool cats that did great things for God.
Next stop on our journey through time, we arrive in England in the 1600s. Here we meet a woman named Susanna Wesley, who was born in 1669. Susanna is a great example of what an impact one mother can make. She was the mother of John and Charles Wesley, two men who had a phenomenal mark on Christianity. Susanna actually had 19 children, but only 10 of her children survived. Susanna Wesley was taught by her father to read, and so she was able to teach each of her own children to read and gave them an education at home. She was very involved in their lives, and one thing she is known for is spending a set 1 hour with each of her children throughout the week. I only have one child at home, and I find it difficult to set 1 whole hour just for her each week. But Susanna was very disciplined, and she instilled that discipline into her children. I really hope you aren't tired from traveling yet, so we are off to Wales in the late 1700s to meet a girl named Mary Jones. Mary was born in 1784. When Mary was a girl, she had learned to read, and she wanted a Bible all of her own. The nearest copy she could have access to was over 2 miles away, and the nearest town that sold Bibles was 25 miles away. She was from a poor family, and so she had to save up to buy her Bible. She did chores for other people and raised chickens and sold the eggs to save the money. It took her 6 years to save up enough money, and she walked the 25-mile distance to get her own Bible. When she got there, the man in charge, Rev Charles, told her all the Bibles were sold. When he heard how she had saved for so long and how much she wanted a Bible of her own, he gave her one he had set aside for someone else. Reverend Charles was so inspired by her story that he worked even harder to raise awareness of the need for the availability of Bibles. I mention Mary Jones because when I was a kid, I earned a book reward from BMA, Bible Memory Association, which was Mary Jones and her Bible. I think I was around 9, and I just loved that book and Mary's story. I read that book more than a few times. It had an impact on me personally and how important and special the Bible is.
All right, thank you for sharing. Next, we will hear about some more amazing women who did their part for such a time as this. But we must hear from our sponsors.
Pepsi-Cola, it's the spot, 12 ounces, that's a must, twice as much more nickel too. Pepsi-Cola is the drink for you. Nickel, 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 nickel. Pepsi-Cola gets the spot, 12 full ounces, that's a lot, twice as much for a nickel too. Pepsi-Cola is the drink for you.
Next, we arrive at New York in the early 1800s. Here we meet Fanny Crosby, who was one of our great hymn writers. Fanny was born in 1820 and probably is one of the best known American Christian women. She had an eye infection as a baby and ended up blind, but it did not seem to discourage her. In her lifetime, Fanny Crosby wrote close to 8,000 hymns, and her words have inspired and comforted so many people, not just during her lifetime, but the impact goes on and on. Safe in the Arms of Jesus is probably my favorite if I had to pick one of her songs. It's one of those that runs through my head when I feel sad or discouraged. All right, let's take a trip across the seas. Our next travel is a somber one. We travel to China to meet an American missionary, Betty Stam. In 1934, Betty Stam and her husband John were murdered by Chinese communist soldiers during the Chinese Civil War. If you aren't familiar with the story, Betty's husband was beheaded and then she was killed moments later, but their 3-month-old daughter, Helen, survived. Betty was only 28 years old when she died, but yet her life had made such a great impression. Her obedience and dedication to Christ still inspires missionaries all over the world. So that brings us to today, this year, 1953. As I look at these women, it reminds me of how much God has a place and a purpose for each one of us. Each one of us has such a time as this. The lives of these Christian women instill in me how important it is to walk with the Lord on a daily basis, to be where He wants and in His will at all times. I think God has placed us all here and in the time frame of history that He wants. But we have to be close to the Lord in order to really fulfill the purpose He has planned for us. We've only just hit the surface of these women's lives as we've had our little travel through history and time. But I encourage you to study about these Christian women and any others that you can think of. Their lives will inspire you. Maybe decades down the road, there will be people reading about you and the things that you have done for God. Wouldn't that be so amazing? So, I leave you tonight with a closing thought. Are you impacting history? Think about that, ladies, and good night. We will see you next time.